Chaos family, my name is Jordan and today we are learning how to set up lighting for nighttime scenarios and utilize denoising for faster preview. If you want to follow along, you can find the scene in the description below. The denoiser detects areas of the image where noise is present and smooths them out, helping us to get a cleaner render. Let's open the render settings and navigate to the render elements tab. Go ahead and add the V-Ray denoiser from the list. Scroll down the denoiser settings and let's switch from the V-Ray denoiser to the NVIDIA AI denoiser. It works really fast and is a great option for quick previews. For production renders, it's best to switch back to the V-Ray denoiser as it is more accurate. To start things off, let's bring in an HDRI from Chaos Cosmos by downloading it and drag and drop it in the viewport. Also, turn on the interactive renderer and set the bug shading to lighting, so we can better observe the changes we make to the lighting. Since we're going for the night look, we might have to adjust the strength of our environment. So let's bring the intensity of the dome light to something like 0.35. The next step is to find the right angle for our HDRI by going to the material editor and changing the horizontal rotation in the texture settings. I think a value of 90 degrees works well for this image. One more thing I would like to improve on the environment is to make it a bit more contrasting. The easiest way is to tweak the gamma of the HDRI. Keep in mind this works better with very fine changes. I will go from 1 to 0.9 just to bring a bit of contrast in the image. If you go in the other direction and set values higher than 1, the HDRI will lose some contrast and the lighting will appear softer. Now that the general lighting is set, we can go and set some artificial lights. I will start with the more obvious ones, the street lamps. Let's just stop rendering while we create objects and we will resume it once we need to tweak the light settings. From the toolbar, let's create a V-Ray rectangle light, generally the size of one of the street lamps, and place it accordingly. Let's rename it for convenience. Now, we can just instance it across all the street lamps in our scene. We're ready to resume interactive rendering and start tweaking the lights. The first big thing I notice is there is definitely not enough light being emitted. Let's go to the edit panel and up their intensity to something around 1500. Now we're seeing some light coming from the street lamps. Let's give it an orange color so that it better represents the light coming from an electric bulb. Another thing that we want to emulate is that light coming from street lamps is usually concentrated in a cone shape. And right now our light is shining in all directions. We can easily do that by tweaking the directionality parameter. For this case, a value of 0.6 seems to work well. Lastly, let's just make the V-Ray light invisible, as we already have some geometry with a light material giving the impression of a bulb shining in the lamp. We're using the V-Ray light just for the emitted light into the scene, we don't need to see it in that case. Now that we have taken care of the street lamps, let's move on to the building and see how we can light the facade. Again, stop the IPR while we add stuff and we can get back to it after we have placed our light sources. From the V-Ray toolbar, let's create an IES light pointing up and give it an appropriate name. IES lights are very useful for architectural renderings, as they use real-world data from manufacturers to recreate how light spreads from an actual lamp. For the IES light to work properly, it needs an IES file loaded in it, which contains the lighting data. Okay, let's instance the IES light around the building where we have geometry for lamps and we can get back to interactive rendering so that we can tweak the lighting. There are a few steps that are pretty much the same as with the rectangle light, like tweaking the intensity and color of the IES light so that they complement our image well. Again, going with a warm tone, and with the particular scene we might need to crank up the intensity of the IES to something around 500,000 so that it looks good. This value will depend on the scene camera exposure, and the IS file that is being used. With all that done, all we're left to do is create the interior lighting for the building. For that, we'll use the V-Ray disc light. Create one from the V-Ray toolbar and let's place it in the scene. Name it appropriately. For the interior lighting, I will rely on small sources placed around the ceiling of the building on every floor to better imitate the lighting in a building. That's why I will set the radius to 15 and instance the light all over each floor of the building. The lighting setup can also be simplified with fewer, larger sources of light. Now, because of the material override we have set up, we can't really see how the lights affect our scene. An easy workaround is to simply hide the window's geometry so that we can see inside. The settings of the disc light are almost the same as that of other V-Ray lights. Again, we will focus on changing the intensity and the color of the light, and again, we will go with a warm hue. But since I want the interior to pop up a bit more in the image, I will make it more saturated than the other lights we've placed. With everything set, we can unhide the window's geometry and also disable debug shading. Let's let the image render for a bit, just so that we get a more accurate idea of what our final render will look like. Now that we have placed quite a lot of lights in our scene, controlling them can become hard. For an easier experience, we can open the V-Ray light lister, where we have all the scene lights with some of their more commonly used settings listed. From here, we can easily make the interior lights invisible, so that we don't see the disc lights themselves. You can notice that even though they're invisible, we can still see them in the reflections. So let's remove the check mark from reflections. Okay, now that the lighting is set, we can prepare things for production rendering. Let's open up the render settings and first switch back to the V-Ray denoiser, as it is more accurate than the NVIDIA AI denoiser. Then we can set the resolution and furthermore lower the noise threshold a bit, so that we get a cleaner image from the raw render, and not have to rely as much on denoising. Don't forget to save your render from the VFB once rendering is done. Click the save icon, pick a name and image file format for your render and click save. Now that you've learned how to set up nighttime lighting for your renders, feel free to check out the rest of our tutorials for V-Ray for 3ds Max.